Hello, everybody, and welcome to this interesting panel that I have the honor to moderate, where we're going to try to extract from the collective intelligence of the local juries to share the insights from the different regions. But first, I want to thank the Holcim Foundation for making the awards possible. It's a tremendous, rigorous, and generous effort to create an instance of architectural knowledge exchange. And you are living it during these days. You are already exchanging, learning from each other, and the strong network that you're weaving is perhaps one of the biggest rewards. And of course, to have these discussions in Venice from all places, it is not a coincidence. And we are very thankful for Holcim to invite us as media partners, because we share the same goals: to inspire and inform the global community of architects about the pivotal role of sustainable design in shaping the future of our built environment. And this award is a representation of the diverse and rich world that we're living in. And your projects are that representation: different contexts, different typologies, different budgets. And it is a pendulum that moves between the global issues from energy scarcity, water conservation, community buildings, integration, inclusion, affordability, repurposing. And on the other extreme, how do you create the local solutions that are an expression of your local context? And the jury has had a tremendous work to do, filtering more than 500 projects to extract the value and knowledge of the 20 awarded projects that you have been witnessing during these days. Some of these projects, you can already visit them. Others are in construction stage, others in project delivery, and others will really benefit from this award, having a final push that will probably make them become a reality. So now we're going to open a window into the work of the jury, the collective jury, to learn from these insights through the chairs of the local juries. And we're going to do this around two themes. First, repurposing architecture, a new paradigm for sustainable development. And for this first part, we're going to invite the heads of jury of Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America. So I want to join us in the stage, Manit, Belinda, and Craig. And as Laura said yesterday, many of you don't need an introduction, but we still are going to make it. So you have a little more knowledge of where these ideas are coming from. So first, we have Manit Rastogi, founding partner of Morphogenesis in New Delhi, India, where he deals with the tremendous challenges of the world's most populated nation, including India's largest building. But Manit's responsibility goes beyond buildings, because he plays an important role with urban policymakers, trying to get them understand the importance of the built environment. And through that, he is one of the founders of the Griha Council, India's own green rating system. Belinda is co-founder of Ecosistema Urbano, based between Madrid, Spain, and Boston in the US, where she's a professor at the GSD. Ecosistema Urbano has been widely recognized for their work and contribution to the built and natural environment. So this is something that we will take from here, because Ecosistema Urbano is operating at the intersection of urbanism, architecture, engineering, but also networks and sociology, resulting in projects that understand that the architecture project goes beyond the singular building, and it's an integral part of our ecosystem. And Craig Dykers, one of the founders of Snøhetta, that is a place nobody is from, but anyone can experience. And it's integrated architecture, landscape, and design practices, where they have had the opportunity to work from the banknotes of Norway, the Norway Bank, to the redesign of Times Square across diverse scales. So to start this global conversation, I want to start with the big picture and ask each of you, starting with you, Manit, which is your reading of the state of architecture in the Asia Pacific, and what do you think that are the challenges that architecture is facing? Yes, please.
Thanks. Well, there are only challenges in this region, and given the fact that the region is extremely complex, and you rightfully said, I mean, India is the most populous nation. You have China, and then you have advanced cities or city-states like Singapore. You have Australia. So, in some senses, it's this Asia-Pacific region is a microcosm of the universe. It's got all the climatic zones. It's got huge issues of density, population, migration, and infrastructure issues. So, at one level, we keep talking about carbon emissions. And of course, that's fundamentally important to achieving the goals of climate change and how much the global temperature should rise. But the problems of the Asia-Pacific are, by and large, if you leave out some of the countries, is to do with simple things: clean air, access to clean water, sanitation, basic infrastructure, simple economic advancement. So most of these countries are predominantly agricultural, and now they're moving to an industrialized status, and in time they will move to the services industry. But this is causing a lot of migration and pressure on the cities, where buildings are tending to get larger, higher, more and more complex. The mass transit systems aren't there, so there's a lot of reliance on mobility, on personal vehicles. And all of this is just sort of making these cities mega cities and pushing them to virtually bust at the seams. So I think that's really where the core issues lie. And dealing with these issues is becoming far more difficult and complicated, not for any other reason except for the fact that people aren't used to living like this. These are very large tracts of land, very large countries, and people are sort of moving from rural, semi-urban, suburban to extremely dense, high-rise living, and with infrastructure that doesn't really support it. So,
very interesting, because for sure that in this state of growth, it's not just about the built environment, but also about answering this question: how do we live in this among millions of others of human beings, and how do we relate to each other, and how do we connect?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, more than half of the world lives here and growing.
And for you, Belinda, which is your vision of the state of architecture and its challenges in the European region?
Yes, so there was a lot of building, and there was very few projects that were more landscape or urban design. And within the buildings, there were two topics that were very present. The first one was about materiality and technical resolution. So there was a lot of projects that were exploring new construction techniques and new construction technologies. And also there was a strong emphasis on the social aspect and how architecture can try to address the social issues of a particular neighborhood. There was also a lot of projects that were trying to come up with, again, construction solutions to minimize the construction times, trying to make construction assemblage faster and therefore more efficient. So yeah, and then there was a number of projects also working with existing buildings, as we saw also in the awardees. So yeah, there was a little bit of everything, but mostly it was buildings instead of open space, public space, or landscape space, and with a strong emphasis on the social aspect compared, I guess, to other editions or to the past when I was a participant. So, yeah.
No, it's very particular because some issues start to become common, but for sure that in Europe are expressed in a different way, and especially with the built environment. For me, it's very impressive that when you fly between European cities at night, you see that it's a constant construction. Everything is constructed.
Yes, absolutely.
And Craig, how do you see this, the state of architecture in North America and its challenges?
Thank you. Let's first put the elephant in the room out on the stage. The United States economy remains the largest economy in the world in terms of strength and capacity. In some ways, this has a good side. I mean, money can be helpful. But strong economies also can be very, very dangerous. And we see that in many ways. people become complacent, so they use the strong economy to stand in for their possibilities of learning from other parts of the world. So they're often ignorant in this region about the practices of other places. Even across the border to Canada and to Mexico, there's a little bit of a loss of transnational interests, as you might find in other places. The second thing that's interesting is the colonizers of America, of which most are European, but also from other nations and continents, have been there so long now that they've even lost touch with their heritage of where they've come from, so they don't even necessarily connect to those worlds either. All of that is leading to a kind of numbness, which is a problem in the region. Certainly we see that across the border to Mexico, where there's still a political divide that is very challenging for cross-communication. So one hopes that even that border can open up more intellectually, because we have a lot to learn in the northern regions of America from Mexico and from the central and southern portions of America that are often led by lesser economies. And I find, as many of you may find, lesser economies are more inventive because they have to be. And so that somehow needs to fuse into the North American market. Another thing I would say is that on the good side, on the positive side, America, and that means Canada, Canadian Americans and US Americans in your question, are very good at creating new technologies. They're very energetic when it comes to technology. So we're seeing quite good moves forward with new construction methodologies that are more intelligent than they used to be, mainly using science as a basis, more efficient ways of building and so on. So I think that's the positive side of it. And other people can at least learn from that, even if the Northern America region should be learning more from other places.
Oh, interesting, because as you mentioned, being the largest economy is something positive, it's abundance of resources, but also it's a force that doesn't allow you to move without much freedom. It's an interesting paradox that we will go back to. And now in this fast-growing world, we are becoming aware that we are extracting faster than it can generate. And what does it mean? And this has become a tremendous issue that I have to say I'm a bit hopeful because the world of architecture understood, and even if it could be something a bit going against our main mandate of creating new buildings, that it is that we need to repurpose what is existing, hopefully avoiding demolition, and find value on the legacy structures. But of course that this is expressed in very different ways across the region. So I want to ask you, Manit, how do you see the challenge of repurposing buildings in the Asia Pacific?
So, you know, there are two parts to this. Buildings, old buildings in the cities in this region generally get destroyed simply because you can build that much more, because technology now allows you to build higher, faster, and replace the older buildings. Now, that's a problem. However, what we found very interesting in the whole award submission was that there were many projects that were actually aiming to do something different. What they were aiming to do was, the reason you need to build more in the cities are people are migrating to the cities. So the projects that, in fact, the 3 out of the 4 projects that we looked at, and the 2 that won, the gold and the silver, they both attempted at trying to create models in the rural or outskirts or in the country, where you could take something that existed, conserve it, not only conserve it, but start putting uses to it where people do not need to migrate to the cities. And that we saw coming out time and again as an underlying theme. So if you can stop that migration and start repurposing buildings that are in the suburban rural areas, and start creating ecosystems where you don't only live, but where you can work, where you can study, where you can have community spaces, etc., then you might even encourage the fact that you start a reverse migration, because quality of life today would be much better in those environments than they are in the congested cities of largely Asia Pacific. So in that context, I do think that we were very happy to see that in the entries of that we went through. Many projects across various countries trying to find solutions of how do you repurpose existing infrastructure, existing buildings, so that people can remain in their roots. They don't have to migrate out.
And surely the gold winner of the Asia Pacific is a project that represents this.
Sorry?
The gold winner
yes,
of Asia
absolutely,
Pacific represents
absolutely.
this spirit.
Absolutely, and I mean, the Tulu project that won the gold does that, and it does more than that. I mean, why I think we were unanimous as a jury on this project was the fact that not only does it conserve and bring adaptive reuse into play, but they also managed to tweak the program to provide community facilities, etc., and all the infra that you really think of that you would get in a city, they brought it to this development. And we thought that was highly replicable and scalable as a model throughout the world, where people don't need to get displaced. And that's one of the reasons why I think as a jury we picked that as a unanimous goal, as a solution to this sort of ever-growing problem of increasingly dense cities.
Perfect. And Belinda, as we were mentioning before, the European context is very different. Here we are in dense, compact cities, centenary buildings that somehow we need to take advantage, considering that it's around 2/3 of the existing buildings will still be here by 2050. We need not only to maintain them, but also improve them, improve their performance. So how do you see this challenge in the European context?
Well, our winning project was exactly a retrofitting of an existing building, so that's, it was something that we talk about a lot among the jury members. So obviously, I think architecture has the power to transform something existing into something extremely innovative, and trying to understand the energy embedded into every single built environment, trying to make the most of it is something that is very related to our profession. Sometimes the problem is that the code is too constraining, and actually, even if there is a will or a possibility to transform a building into something else, maybe it does not comply with the code. So actually, it's, the developer or whomever decides to demolish the building instead of just trying to change the code. So I think there is a great potential, and there was a number of projects, not that many, but they were working with existing buildings. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
And well, when we look at North America, there is a vast territory that moves between a duality of this extensive suburban model, but also concentrated hotspot, where is the wealth, where is the growth, and that both have different challenges. But of course, that these market forces push that the repurposing and reutilization and maximization of the space in these dense hotspots is it's constructed in a very particular way. So how do you see this challenge of repurposing in North America?
Well, one of the things I would say I'm especially proud of in the region, and this is perhaps more true in Canada and the northern reaches of the United States, and now I'm only giving the 2 countries we were asked to talk about, so I'm not talking about Mexico or other regions nearby that are part of this context. But certainly in the US and in Canada, we've seen a refocusing of interest and redefining the question, and not just talking about architecture or buildings, although buildings are very important. They're redefining and repurposing streets, or redefining and repurposing mobility. Changes in the way in which we move and occupy cities, as opposed to focusing only on individual structures. I'm not saying that's not important, I'm just saying that for me this is a very interesting component of the northern regions of Northern America. That I think has a lot of value in terms of sustainability. Some of it is misguided. So redefining mobility or repurposing mobility, for instance, in Cuba, it means just making sure your 1925 car still runs, which is a great thing, which is the same concept as repurposing a building or redefining its life. But in the US and in other parts of this region, you find it once again, reliance on technology. Let's make a bunch of electric cars and everything will be fine. And yes, they do make a difference, but they also have their problems. And so the technology side often underwhelms this movement, but there's a lot of people talking about cities in a larger perspective in Northern America that I think is good. The other thing that's happening is they're reluctant to refurbish or repurpose buildings because of the economy in most cases. So when you have a very strong economy, it's like, who cares? Let's knock it down and build something else because we got the money. Whereas in economies that are less robust, you have to repurpose. And you see that in North America too, or in Northern America, where small towns who were horribly impacted by the Depression in the 20s and never rebuilt, those towns are pretty intact, and people reused all the buildings in those towns. But then in places like New York City, where the economy is constantly growing, buildings get knocked down, almost every day, well, definitely every day, and rebuilt. So I think in this region, economy, again, is related to consequence and answers to that question. You can't separate the two.
Interesting, because also this has led to something that is very positive, that is to remove highways, liberate that space for the people, and also the waterfront, the port activities, and try to turn it into a common space. And well, one of the projects from the North America was doing exactly that.
Yes, it's true. And places like colonized places, most of them were colonized at the time when ships were the primary transport. So the waterfronts became the powerhouse of these colonizing nations. But they're not always the best places to live or build. If you had your choice, you'd probably build or live somewhere else. And so the waterfronts are becoming less used now as commercial activity, and how to make those stay alive as useful waterfronts that are also biological and habitat related, as opposed to industrial and commercially related, is another stage that we see happening there.
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning, North America is very optimistic about technology, and sustainability often is associated with high tech.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we understand that it's the low tech that actually has the chance to really drive change. So how do you see this duality expressed in North America?
It's a great question for this particular region. I mean, I can remember one time at a very, very fancy dinner with some very wealthy people, and I was the architect at the table. I think Norman Foster was there too, and we were the dog and pony show. That's what happens when you're an architect at a dinner. They're like, ooh, they're gonna entertain us. And the first question was, what is the hottest new green technology? Because these are very wealthy people with quite a lot of money and influence. And the question was loaded. It's like there's something out there and I can just push a button and it's gonna make me green. And what came to my head first, and I unfortunately didn't say this because it would have been too harsh, but I said, well, probably the hottest new thing you can do is remove all of your houses except for one, and just have one house, walk to the grocery store. That's a big shift, and that talks about the mind in relation to climate. Technology disassociates your brain and your body from the problem. And so that's been an issue there where the technology is a surrogate solution, when it's really us that has to be addressed first. You can't control Mother Nature without controlling human nature first.
I hope you get invited to more of those dinners, because this is going to be a rising preoccupation in the US with this optimism for technology, and someone needs to bring the counterbalance to that discussion.
Yeah.
Belinda, in this rapid growth, in this frenziness, it seems that we forgot nature, and now we are asking for it back. We're trying to bring it back into the city to regenerate ecosystems. And how do you see this trend that also was very present in the European projects?
Yeah, that's something that is really exciting. One of the things that we were also discussing this morning in the workshop is that there was this lack of large-scale projects, and I understand, my guess is because one of the requirements is that these projects are going to be executed in the short term, and when you are doing an urban design, urban planning, or big, large-scale project, it's not going to be maybe implemented in 2 years or in 3 years, right? So, but at the same time, in the face of climate change, we need to encourage these type of projects to come in, trying to mitigate heat. You know, there's going to be large areas of the world that are going to be very impacted by the extreme heat, especially affecting the most vulnerable. So this idea that is not only, again, about building new things, it's about, you know, trying to look what we have and how to make the cities more resilient in terms of water conservation, in terms of permeability, in terms of temperature. So I think there is, you know, there's a whole niche there of solutions that can contribute to the conversation, and I hope that in following editions, we get to see a little more of these kind of projects that are just measurements or strategies to improve the air quality, to improve the temperature, to improve the renaturalization of the cities.
And this is, I think it's very positive, and also the general society is becoming aware, because during this last summer,
It was awful.
and it's an understanding, it is happening.
It was in the news. People are not ready, buildings are not ready, and public space is definitely not ready. And usually the people who have less quality domestic space, they need the public space even more, and in these environments it's even worse. So this idea of, again, you know, shade, canopy, materiality, permeability, water conservation is all together, and it will create the conditions for us to be outdoors.
And sounds very simple, somehow obvious, yet, well, architects, we need to embrace this. And by looking at the overall projects, we understand that, or we can see that architects are understanding that we need to move from an extractive architecture to an architecture that contributes, and hopefully it starts to regenerate. And Manit, do you think, also not just with the architects that you have been connected now, but with the architects in general in India, do you think that there is a change of mindset of what architecture should be?
So, you know, it's a complex answer. The question that, I think the answer to that question really is, it's a sort of a cart and horse problem. What comes first? I think all architects, in the, you know, in their very nature, if you see anyone's work or talk about architecture, they're very there is no convincing that the work is talking about sustainability. The work is talking about passive design. It is talking about, you know, simple things of natural daylight, air movement, and that's what every architect's ambition is to really. And that's in the DNA. And it's not like, you know, Craig rightfully said, it's not because they want to and it's a fashionable thing to do. It's because there is really no choice. Resources are limited. And it is the right way to do things, and the only way to do things in some senses. However, the problem does not come, that's not where the problem is. The problem actually sits from the fact that there is an aspiration. Now that aspiration also tends to break down, or used to break down a lot from the northern hemisphere. I won't call it the West, but it's, you know, it's actually the North. I don't know why everyone calls it the West. So it is the northern hemisphere. And, you know, so when they began to see all these big glass buildings in New York, the first set of big buildings, office buildings that came up over the last 2.5 decades were glass buildings. But there's a big difference. You know, the temperatures in India can go up to 45 degrees Celsius in the day. Suddenly, 5,000 years of architecture was abandoned overnight, when everyone seemed to have forgotten where the sun is. The one thing that's the constant. And buildings weren't responding to that anymore. But I think we've sort of gone through that cycle now. And hopefully, we are beginning to see that mindset shift also in clients. And I think that mindset shift is also coming from various other, and I was discussing this last night at dinner, is there's a lot of ESG compliance that has come onto companies, onto industries. And that's sort of pushing back, or that's also pushing architects to perform better, to do better. So I think overall, I'm very, very optimistic that the direction from here onwards is a step in the right direction. But you're absolutely right. It's only common sense. But common sense is one of the hardest to find.
Yes, exactly. And you, Belinda, how do you see this change of mindset, especially as also you are an educator, you are seeing how the next generation of architects is thinking about this?
Well, I have mixed feelings in the way that, of course, education is super important, but sometimes I feel that the new generations, they are a little bit overwhelmed with the situation. So there is actually the climate change anxiety experts talking about it. Yeah. So it's really, sometimes I feel that we still have to show there is there is a possibility to improve things, because sometimes, data and scientists are, proving us how many things are going to go wrong in the coming years, and sometimes, and I really truly believe that design has the answers for many of these issues. So we have to keep on inspiring the students. We have to keep on showing them paths to, to improve the world, because sometimes the facts are so overwhelming that they get paralyzed. So I have the luxury of being teaching, but also being a practitioner, which I love very much, because I like to navigate utopian ideas, but also like to bring some of these utopian ideas to reality and trying to bring a little bit of the reality into the school. So I try to inspire students, and I think they're very aware about the environmental issues that they're facing, and they're very, I don't know, again, overwhelmed, but I hope they get, they get some tools to tackle them. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. And well, Craig, you give us in a way, a glimpse into the reality check of the decision makers in the US. And what do you think about this thinking of the architects, from the point of view of architects?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I am seeing a shift, a very positive one, in the relevance and power of landscape architects in the world of design that we normally occupy the central seat in. And I think that's having a positive influence, and I think more of it will help people understand how to make decisions, because you can't just base it on some sort of postcard view of what a building should look like. People are realizing that the ecosystem that a building occupies doesn't stop at the door or the roof. All of that stuff exists within a larger habitat. And I think as that grows more and more, to the point where maybe we'll have more landscape architects even speaking in these forums. I mean, in my office, we're landscape architecture and architecture sitting side by side, and we have landscape architects leading architecture jobs. It changes everything, really. But it's important in more ways than one. One is the obvious one. Well, the site and the soil and the terrain and all of that and the habitat nearby. But it expands well beyond that. So, I mean, we haven't really made the connection yet to this lonely child, landscape and habitat. And here's an example that I have in my head. All of us, or nearly all of us, if not all of us, went through COVID, locked in a room, or terrified to death on day one that we were all going to die if we looked the wrong direction. And, this was an incredibly impactful moment in contemporary history. And it all goes back to habitat. There was some creatures whose habitat was negatively influenced, who weren't able to occupy their habitat in the way they would normally, and disease shed even more forcibly than it has in the past, because we've always had pandemics, but this was a stronger one. Those places where those creatures lived their resources were being taken away from them to feed the things we build or make or eat or whatever. And so a landscape architect and a person with a biological understanding can see that network, and they can see that it affects us in more ways than simply carbon sequestration and climate change in terms of temperature. So I think that is changing in the region where I am, and I'm hopeful that it will make a more positive impact.
Perfect. I take from your hopefulness.
Oh, yeah, well, my fingers are crossed.
Now, to close this first panel, I want to summarize and ask each of you, what would you say that is the lesson learned from the Asia Pacific that can be helpful for the rest of the world? Manit?
Well, I think the lesson that I have learned is by seeing the work from all the award entries is how, when I said this yesterday, is how to do a lot more with a lot less. And I think that's truly inspirational. We've seen the repeated failures of top-down intervention by the governments in trying to implement master plans that are fundamentally based around statistics and outdated, and they really haven't solved the problem. But what we can see now is our solutions that are more bottom-up. Small change that can make a difference at a very local level, but has the ability to succeed and scale rapidly. And I think it is this bottom-up change that is sort of more citizen-driven, that is more local, that's grassroots, which I think will make all the difference. So I think I'm very excited to see all of this.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing this insight. For you, Belinda, the lessons learned.
Yeah, in a similar line, there was a lot of emphasis, as I was mentioning at the beginning, on the social aspect and how a building can perform beyond the energy efficiency, but in a social way, how a building can contribute to a better neighborhood or a better city. There was also a lot of emphasis on these participatory processes and how to come up with new management systems and new ways of governance, which I think is very fascinating, considering that housing is becoming less and less affordable. So I just wonder, can we come up with new economic schemes that make space available for people? So I hope to see more of that. But again, this kind of transition between only the building as a very, let's say, perfect machine performing on its own as something that is an urban machine performing as part of a larger network. So I enjoy that part.
Perfect. Thank you. And Craig, which is your lesson from North America to the world?
First of all, if the other jury members I imagine are here, I want to thank them. I didn't get the opportunity before now, but they were incredibly powerful thinkers, and wow, I mean, I was at times just kind of repositioning my brain to hear them. And so that was one thing that was influential, and I don't know, I think all the regions probably had similar content in their juries. But for me, and I'm only answering for myself, the biggest moment was when we awarded the Acknowledgement Prize to the Saskatchewan Powwow Arbor, which didn't quite fit into anything. It was like, well, it's not a building, it's not, you can't really do these in Detroit, all of that. But it's there, and it was powerful. And the reason why it's powerful in some levels goes back to the elephant in the room, and that is economics. While I say, and it's a stereotype, that this is one of the strongest economies in the world, and it does affect thinking. The truth is, hundreds of millions of people do not benefit from that economy. Most of the people in the region I live in are poor, they have hard lives. I mean, they're not as poor as in some places, obviously, but they struggle very hard. And so those places now in my region, and this was a kind of small representation of that, are starting to make their own world, their own sustainable world. You see it in Detroit with small organizations of underrepresented people who have little economy. You'll see it in Mississippi or other places where these groups are showing how they think about things, which is completely different than the mainstream understanding of sustainable and socially, environmentally, and financially sustainable solutions. And that little project, although I loved it for other reasons too, but it did show me that there's hope for the grassroots that you're talking about to make a difference. And the more we focus on that, and if these awards can bring more of those people in, because they're building stuff. These people are building things. It's not like they're just collecting money to have bake sales. They're actually making stuff. And they could get awards too.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you again to the three of you, and now we will continue into the following session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. Thank you. Thank you, Craig. So now I want to invite to the stage Tatiana Bilbao and Lesley Lokko, chairs of the jury from Latin America and Middle East and Africa, respectively. And from the Global South, we're going to discuss about how scarcity is an innovation catalyst in the built environment. And again, I want to start from your global overview. But first, our introductions that are very important because we're here with our host, Lesley Lokko, director of the African Future Institute based in Accra, Ghana. A writer, novelist, but also an experienced educator that has taught, I think, many of this new wave of Global South architects. Lesley is the curator of the 2023 Architecture Biennale, that with a strong focus on Africa and the global issues in the region, I think that has shifted the view of architectural debate and opened a much needed bridge into and between the Global South, being part of a global movement that I think will continue to unfold from now on. Tatiana Bilbao, from Tatiana Bilbao Estudio in Mexico, is also an experienced educator. And her projects in Mexico, Europe, and China deal with the challenges of sustainability, density, domesticity, affordability, and the social landscape. And they have been widely recognized for being an expression of these challenges, together with the local workers and the materials that are an intrinsic part of her architecture. So now I want to start this conversation by having your global overview of what is the state of architecture and its challenges in the Middle East and Africa, Lesley.
That's a very big question. Well, first I would also like to say that it's a real delight to meet Tatiana in person, and I've had to come to the Global North to do it, so that's something that we should change. I mean, I think these regional groupings are also quite difficult. They're quite complex. So to talk about architecture on the African continent is difficult enough. You know, 4 broad regions, north, west, east, and south, with very, very different construction, economic, cultural, linguistic backgrounds. And the Middle East is a kind of anomaly as well. The grouping of Turkey in the Middle East was also something that we talked about. So I think to begin that conversation is to say that these are quite complex entities. The Middle East, and it often gives me a little bit of a shiver to say the Middle East because I kind of wonder, well, from whose middle, but is a really dynamic region at the moment. So we in Africa are looking towards the Middle East somewhat enviously, I think, of the resources, the imagination, the kind of power, the ability to speak to the rest of the world from that center. So the conversation was, in the jury, was really about trying to find a common ground, some common medium by which you could begin to judge things that come out of very, very different contexts. So this made the conversation both complex but also incredibly rich, because our biases, our perspectives, our preconceptions really came to the fore.
Perfect. Well, we're going to dig deeper, opening from this macro view and into, well, as you say, it's one region for the purpose of the awards, but they are very different between themselves. And for you, Tatiana, which is your reading of the state of architecture in Latin America and its challenges?
I mean, one of the challenges is that, to understand that every place in Latin America has been defined by very different cultures. So it's just a little bit the same, no? So although the region has been flattened historically because of the colonization of one single empire, almost only one, no, except Brazil, that flattened the region as if it was one space. It did kind of make a cultural cohesion that works in a sense, but at the same time, with the same conditions that they work in one region, is the problems that they have of every place. So we had that problem, no, of really kind of trying to understand how to see these projects within its own specific context, rather than seeing it from a general lens. And that was, that I think is one of the challenges of Latin America. Because although independence happened 200 years ago, more or less, throughout the region, it really never gained independence, because independence is really when every single culture that is embedded in that region is able to reproduce, produce, express itself in full. So I think that one of the challenges of overlooking this region as a region is exactly that, being able to recognize the specific cultures in which every single project is embedded, because they're very, very different.
But I will say that there is something common that between these two regions, and also similar to what Manit was saying. There is a lack of resources that leads to a scarcity that could be seen as something negative, but for me, that I'm very into the world of architecture in Latin America, I see that this is a catalyst for innovation. It's creating something new. I'm always very amazed when people go to Chile and tell me, David, it's fantastic, these exposed concrete houses, they look incredible. And my answer is, this is the cheapest way to do it. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's really no, it's an expression of this more with less. And I want to ask you, Lesley, how do you see this more with less coming from the region, expressing itself?
So I think that the terms by which we describe these contexts is really important. I mean, I've always understood the word less as a kind of, it has an ethical dimension. Mm-hmm. So it is about not necessarily making do, but making better. And if we're able to shift the way we think about resources, we're also able to shift the way we think about how we spend them. So on the one hand, yes, we're in a context where scarcity and the absence of abundance can be seen as a problem. I actually think of it as an ethical plus. But that's a huge shift to rethink how you approach the natural world, your neighbor, your nature. These are really, really big epistemological changes. And if there's something that an awards ceremony like, or an awards program like this can highlight, it's that there are other ways to think about our relationship to the world that do not result in less or not as good. Actually, they result in better. And that's a big shift. I think it takes more than one generation to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, because it's also a change of perception at the end.
100%, yeah. And it starts in education, it evolves into practice, it really is about changing who we are. Yeah.
And as you say, it takes time to sink in. And for you, Tatiana, how do you see this more with less being expressed across Latin America?
I mean, I completely agree on what Lesley is saying, and yes, it is also a true honor to meet you here on the stage. And because when I always hear, no, it's like, oh yeah, you do more with less, and scarcity produces creativity. I feel very scary, you know. I get goosebumps because it's being seen in a very paternalistic way, you know, of exoticizing in a way the lack of resources, and that is very problematic. But if we really understand that that is not where creativity comes, but that is where we need to be, and that technology doesn't solve the problems, and that technology and money doesn't necessarily create more better life and better possibilities, then we talk about a different vision, and then we talk about the incredible human and natural resources we have to provide and create the world that surrounds us, and that should be, no? So I really think in the same way that we really profoundly need to take out the paternalistic view on how things are solved in our countries, and understand that there is open paths for a different way of living, understanding life, and changing the paradigms that we urgently need to change, because we have been clearly proven as society that technology and money, they won't arrive to all of us in the world ever, and they would not provide a better quality of life as we see it in the places where there's more possibilities, no?
No, super interesting contrast and what it drives.
Yeah, and I mean, I think back to the sort of era of African independence in the 60s and 70s, and the difference between the Francophone and the Anglophone worlds. And in the Anglophone worlds, there was an idea that somehow technology would be the driver of progress. So you found schools of architecture in most of the English-speaking African countries were located in universities of science and technology, not in the arts and the humanities, which in itself is a kind of a strange schism. And in the Francophone world, much more humanistic in its approach. So the Francophone Africa produces poets and writers and playwrights and philosophers. And the Anglophone world was producing engineers and doctors and lawyers. And it's not exactly that, but there was a strong drive. And you can see now, sort of 50, 60, 70 years later, the location of the schools of architecture in those camps is producing its own problematic. And so somehow the idea that architecture as a discipline, and this is where I think the issue of sustainability is really important, is that sustainability has the ability to marry those different aspects of architecture, master planning, landscape, and the kind of the whole relationship to the natural world in a way that science and technology won't only, and the humanities won't only. So architecture is this incredible bridge discipline that can kind of pull things together, but it starts in how we teach it, how we approach it, how we understand it. And that's where I would say, certainly in my region of the world, our understanding of what architecture is very, very limited. Most of our buildings are not built by architects.
Exactly. And well, we can see that in some contexts, the trade of architecture becomes highly complex, but it's still multidisciplinary, it is collaborative. We work together with engineers, acoustic designers, landscape architects, and a tremendously growing list of specialists, but also with the communities. And often they are left at the very end of this list, but this top-down model is shifting, and communities are becoming much more active into shaping their built environment on their own, but also finding this new common place, this collaborative space with architecture, with architects. So how do you see, Lesley, this new encounter of really embracing the communities in architecture?
I think it goes back, and I'm thinking particularly of Tatiana's practice, that actually the world is becoming more plural. So the idea that a community activist, a local church, a micro-lender, an environmentalist, a botanist are all part of this sort of ecosystem of building. I think it's one that we already live with. We just don't know how to formalize it. And that the sort of segregation of the disciplines into these very particular specializations, I think works against the idea of a more plural and porous relationship with everything. I mean, if I think about architecture, the way I understood it was really about understanding boundaries. And the more I am in architecture, the more I understand it's about the dissolution of boundaries. And that's not the way we train architects to think. We train in a very particular, specific way. And I know this is going miles away from the entries that we had in the awards program, but you could see, particularly in our regions, people grappling with this idea that I have to build of a certain scale and size and complexity and a certain amount of scientific knowledge to be understood as sustainable. And actually it starts with one's relationship to the earth, to the ground. It's both more complex and simpler than we make it, yeah.
And perhaps the surf school is a great example of this.
100%, and I mean, it's a small project. I think there was one of the conversations was about the scale of a project. But, you know, how do we introduce other metrics into these conversations so that you understand the value? I think Rajiv was talking about aspiration. You know, how do you begin to measure what aspiration means? How to value it? If in a community project like this, you are empowering 50, 60, 100 local youths who would have otherwise had no access to another way of thinking about life, how do we quantify that? I think it's really important that we broaden the conversation and we broaden our language about how we speak about architecture and sustainability and maybe even longevity.
Yeah, different engagement. And well, Tatiana, you mentioned this yesterday in the comments about the region, about the projects because they were very expressive on how they connect with the community. So how do you see this in Latin America, the opportunity to work closer with the communities, and also how architects are in a way channeling this opportunity?
I mean, we really oversaw a lot of projects that are not just compartmentalizing the idea of architecture as doing housing or a school, or although there's a school there, no, but systems of buildings that provide much more openly other possibilities for the places, no? Using, obviously, this is part of what happens a lot in the region, no? Using probably a small building like the surf school or the school in Nueva Venezia that to become catalyst of other things, no? It's not just a school, it's a possibility of the community getting engaged, building, understanding, creating building knowledge for other persons to build their houses or their other spaces, no? So I think that we saw a lot of projects on that, and we in the region, in the jury of the LATAM region, we were focusing very much on understanding much more what is the social impact of this project, what are the networks that it's creating, not only by the who is involved, who has the agency for the project, but what is those agents giving to open paths for other possibilities to exist. And this is how we came up with the winners, no? So to start with, we discarded all the houses because we wanted really to provide possibility to projects that are expanding those networks by what agencies they're creating, no? So, and I think that a lot of the projects in Latin America are doing that, no? And probably is the result of this word that I hate of scarcity, no? Because you have to create platforms with anything you have, with any opportunity you have, to improve relationship networks, possibilities of space with only one school, no? So how can projects enable that was a question, but also there were many answers. There were many projects doing that.
Yeah, perhaps more than a scarcity, is a responsibility to do this more with less. And as you mentioned, the projects are not just solving these basic needs of sheltering, being spaces for gathering, but also to generate economies, something that will last for the long run, that the architects need to be very strategic on how they will kickstart an economy, tourism, or even integration through sports. So how do you see this added perspective that the architects are trying to do with this strategic kind of design?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that strategy is probably a better word than scarcity in a way, because there's a recognition that in these contexts, architecture must operate at its fullest. Mm-hmm. It is not only about the bricks, the mortar, the plan, the section, the embodied carbon, you know, the usual metrics that we apply to those kinds of projects, but it has to do more. It has to go beyond that. And I mean, I really like this word, that the architect is a kind of agent, and it's an agent of change, it's an agent of ecology, it's an agent of dignity, it's an agent of value. The architect is more. So in a strange way, I think it's not at all about scarcity, it's about the opposite of it. It's about a context in which architecture is fully abundant.
And Lesley, you touched a bit about this at the beginning when you're talking about education, architectural education in Africa, and well, it's an ancient continent with a very strong young generation and also young nations that are defining their character, their identity. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, is an important component of the architecture in the region.
It is, and I mean, that also brings us to this conversation around built projects and conceptual projects, because certainly in our context, the conceptual landscape has to be almost as real as the built landscape, because that's the site of exploration, it's the site of protest, it's the site of action. You know, we're the world's youngest continent, but as you say, also the oldest, but we're also the fastest urbanizing. So the kind of forces of development, of urban development, the shift from the rural to the city, it's overwhelming. So the conceptual is also a space of freedom, because it's a space in which you can imagine quite literally something else. And the time scale of the conceptual is really important because it allows you to build tools, confidence, courage in a way that in the, let's say, the more aggressive forces of the present, it's very, very hard to do. So you couple a very, very young population with an incredibly rapacious drive towards extraction, towards building, towards development. The conceptual becomes something else in that space. So, you know, when we were talking in the jury, one of the ways in which we, I think, navigated that gap between talking about the UAE and talking about South Africa and talking about West Africa and North Africa in the same breath was to actually start to look at the different types of projects. You know, we had conversations about classrooms, we had conversations about the tourism industry, we had conversations about cultural sustainability. Like, thinking beyond the norm was also a way to draw us together. Yeah.
Tatiana, among the Latin American projects, it caught my attention their relation with water. Mediators, remediators, wet ecosystems. How would you describe this? Because this is an expression of the issues in Latin America, so it's very present. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that the water is a resource that in Latin America not necessarily has arrived to everybody. No, it should be. It is a human right, no, that we all have water, but this is not the truth. And then constantly we're facing with much more problems or floods or of droughts, which relates to water. So obviously this is a topic that has been present throughout the region for many, many reasons and many ways, and it has become increasingly more important. How to manage it and how to be able to really give it as a right to everybody. No, give it is a bad word. Have it as a right for everybody. And I think that, yes, there were many projects dealing with it, but we were specifically focusing on them probably because they're talking about all the resources possible to create possibilities for social anything, no? So the use of infrastructures in the sake of education, creation of knowledge, domestic environments, they really are doing a lot of things with very little. So we obviously preponderated better those projects who were dealing with water because it's on top one other feature of the possibilities of what architecture can do with strategies and things that work to open more for people.
Here I think you touched something that is, because now we're talking about architecture needs to move from being extractive to be regenerative, but also in this context it needs to be resilient because what it has to endure is constantly being put in talent in a way. So how do you see this subject of resiliency in architecture?
I mean, I think that this needs to happen all over the world, no? Craig was talking a little bit on that. For example, in Miami, they're still demolishing buildings that are going to be flooded in 30 years. So I think in a way we are much more innovative and working much more ahead of time because we are saving the resources that we have in a way, no? So you never think of demolishing a building if it's going to be flooded in 30 years, right? Well, in the US they can think of that because there's an abundance of resources. But in a way I think that the projects in Mexico or in Latin America as well, they're dealing with how we save those resources that we have already spent on what is happening, which is a very different vision, no, on what is the other way around. So not solving things with technology or money, but saving it from behind, which is something that is common in the region for sure.
And if I will ask you about resiliency in the region, because what is happening in the Middle East is putting a pressure that goes beyond resiliency, surviving. How do you see this expressed in the Middle East and then in Africa?
I mean, it's kind of ironic in a sense that we started our jury conversations, you know, way before the 7th of October. So in a sense, the world changed very dramatically, you know, pre-jury to post. And in these contexts, you, again, to go back to this question of architecture not being, it's not a singular thing. So in a context like the Middle East, what does it mean to rebuild? What does it mean to repair? It's a very different conversation to the one that you might have in New York, for example. And yet, consistently, we train architects as if there was one language for architecture. There is one way to think about it. And if there's anything I think this process teaches us is that actually there are multiple ways to think about our relationship to shelter, our relationship to resources, our relationship to care, all of those kinds of things. And I would love to see almost a revolution in architectural education that takes account of the fact that this is not a universal world, that universal values are anything but universal. There may be a shared language, a shared vocabulary, but actually the context in which that vocabulary is deployed really matters.
Well, I remain hopeful about this need. I think it's happening, maybe slowly, but it is. People are being aware.
Absolutely, and I mean, if, you know, at one level, I recognize that we speak quite pessimistically, but I have to say that and it's also an overused word, the kind of energy and talent I see in 2 generations below me is phenomenal. There's something in the way that many young people are able to think across boundaries that for me are sacrosanct, that gives me an incredible amount of hope. Yeah.
Well, and now to summarize this, because we can go for hours, but I think you would like to enjoy Venice. For many of us, it's our last evening. But I would like to summarize, which would you say that are the learnings from the region that the world can learn from?
You go.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think that one of the real common thread in Latin America among the projects we saw, because that's obviously not the array of projects that are happening, but the ones that were submitted to the Holcim Awards, was that they were dealing with a lot of complex issues across space, let's say. So it's not only buildings as a housing building, a house, a school, a museum. It's a complex of issues that provide platforms for a lot of things, for cultural, economical, political, social development, that I think is it's one thing that the region can say, that architecture can really give agency to, in many levels, in a horizontal line, rather than kind of classify them in stages. So projects that are master plan, but landscape, but housing, but cultural programs, but infrastructural, but economical movers, even with one single building. So I think that this is something that we can talk in general about those projects that we received that are being done. And I see it happening also in the region in many ways, in many regards.
I mean, I think there's been a lot of criticism, let's say, over the past 5 years, and certainly a lot of criticism of this Biennale, that there's no architecture and that we need to get back to basics. And what I saw from the entries is actually we are dealing with the basics. I mean, it's the reverse. It's architecture has to go back to other kinds of basics. We don't need to go back to it. It's the reverse relationship. And I always say this, the Zulu word for an architect is a magician of space, a maker of a sensation, and a maker of a situation. Now, any culture that can describe an architect in those 3 ways, that's the essence of architecture. Yeah.
Oh, tremendous insight.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Lesley. Thank you, Tatiana.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And congratulations to you, all the awarded, recognized firms, projects of this award, to the team behind the award. And now I leave you so you can enjoy Venice.